Hello, this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Tonight I'm joined by Crow and Narco and a media mediator to discuss the AAR on today's debate with Banana Warrior Princess on veganism. One of the things to looking back on this that strikes me very clearly is that they didn't really understand what a reductio ad absurdum was. A reductio ad absurdum is not something that the interlocutor believes to be true. It's pointing out that the conclusions using the intuitions and inferences of the opponent leads to absurd conclusions. This reminds me of a statement by the anarcho-capitalist Tom Woods, who said, "In the age of the absurd, beware of the reductio ad absurdum." Because people don't know enough to know that it is absurd, and they don't know that you know it's absurd and don't actually believe it. So I think in part today that sort of was strong evidence for the claim that the warning that Tom Wood gives us. But yeah, it's just clearly a non sequitur. Obviously no reasonable person believes these things. So as I mentioned in the rebuttal video I did 2 weeks ago, some people do. The plants do have rights. So it's not merely hypothetical. This is actually happening now. But I think that media, you had some insights you wanted to add about how this debate went down.
Yeah. The first thing I wanted to do was note the bungle that happened at the beginning of the discussion there. You were trying to have a discussion with them about how their second premise was question begging, and the question got very, very muddled. Now, it took me a little while to understand what exactly you were getting at when you were arguing this. I can pull up the timestamp for that later. I have a whole bunch of notes jotted down. But in the meantime, what I want to do is I want to illustrate for those that would definitely be confused watching this debate how this question is question begging. And so how I'm going to do this is I'm going to reformulate their question, and I'm going to add an obviously absurd twist to it that I'm going to assume nobody in this discussion would actually believe, just to clarify where the absurdity is coming from. Right? So suppose I asked a question kind of like the name the trait question, but I worded it closer to something like this. Name a behavior that, if absent in your wife's actions, would cause you to stop beating her. Right? Obviously, that is an absurd question to ask. But why is it an absurd question to ask? Well, it's an absurd question to ask because it's assuming a whole bunch of stuff we don't know to be true. Namely, A, do I even beat my wife? Right? B, if I beat my wife, which I would never, do I do it in some morally justifiable way? Like, oh, I only beat her because X. I mean, let me clarify this, right? Suppose you try to answer this question, right? There are only two ways you can answer the question as it's directly posed. Either you can name such a behavior, or you can't name such a behavior. If you answer, well, I can't really name a behavior that my wife could omit doing that would cause me to stop beating her. All you're saying in that answer is, I'll beat my wife always. But that's not true. I don't beat my wife. Okay? The other way you can answer the question is, well, there is some behavior that she could stop doing that would cause me to stop beating her. But that answer could easily be interpreted to mean, well, I only beat her because she does X. And that's also equally as absurd, right? So I wouldn't even answer such a question as phrased to me because I don't share the premise, I beat my wife. Now let's look at their question, and theirs is a bit more subtle. I'm not going to be, it's not as flamboyant as the one that I made up. But we can all agree that there's so many absurdities baked into the question that need to be shared for the question to make sense. So for theirs, we should all know it by this point, right? So what I'm going to do is unpack the three premises that are actually present in the question. The question is an argument, right? Banana Warrior Princess presented it as if it was a question. Like, it's an obvious question you should just answer. Well, no, it's a loaded question with an argument built in. So the hidden premise one to this question is this. If two beings possess the same traits, they attain the same moral value. Hidden premise 2. We treat animals with a different set of moral value than we treat human beings. Premise 3. Therefore, well, that's more of a conclusion. Therefore, some trait must exist between humans and animals that's sufficiently different for you to treat them this way, and you have to explain what that is. Okay, that's basically the argument they're making in the questions. The premise 2 is fine. Their hidden premise 2 is fine. We do treat animals differently than humans. That's uncontroversial. And this is a valid argument. So the conclusion is fine. If the two premises are true, the conclusion will certainly follow. The question begging that you're trying to get at happens in hidden premise 1. We don't believe that two beings that have the exact same traits are treated the same moral value. And I'd argue that society as a whole doesn't even believe this. For example, you can pick two human beings in the United States. One is allowed to own guns and one isn't allowed to own guns. Why? Because one's a felon. Well, one person is a felon isn't a trait of his being human. That the person's a felon is an action that person happened to take in the past and isn't a property of his present person, right? So we don't even base our moral decisions on traits of people or objects or things. So the very idea that our moral decisions are based on traits in this way, I find to be absurd. Further, you can flip this. If their premise is actually true, that if two things attain the same traits, that you can treat them with different moral value or the same moral value, then all you have to do to justify treating them differently is make the condition fail to hold, right? If I can make the condition of their traits fail to hold, I can have any conclusion I want. That's the beauty of conditional logical statements. So, for example, if it is raining outside, then it's wet, like you said, right? Well, if I can get rid of the phrase "it's raining outside" and put that into question, well, then whatever's going on outside can be whatever. It can be wet because there's sprinklers. It can be dry because it's sunny. There could be a blizzard. We could be getting hit by meteors. Who knows, right? Once you have a conditional fact and you get rid of the condition, all chaos breaks loose. And this brings all sorts of ethical quandaries to the surface. Now, the best way I think I can explain where the biggest quandary happens here is if I make the following argument, which I think the vegans would definitely object to, right? I'm going to show, using your reductio ad absurdum trick, I'm going to do one of my own, that shows that their implicit framework, especially the way presented in this stream by Banana Warrior Princess, leads to a conclusion that they would not agree to. So here's what I'm going to do. First, note that Banana Warrior Princess, at the 1 hour 17 mark-ish in your stream, said that if you don't have sentience, nothing matters, right? Further, note that later in the discussion, I didn't get a timestamp for this because this happened before I could finish taking down all my notes in the last run of the stream, where you're talking about fetuses and pigs. The discussion got really, really, really rattled. And there's a whole bunch of blunders and cluster screw-ups that happened there, but that's a whole other thing. But later in the discussion, she said in her discussion on abortion that there exists a state of development for a fetus in which it has no sentience, right? Now, I'm not arguing abortion. Let's assume for the topic that I'm agnostic on abortion. I think me and some of you guys in the stream would actually have disagreements on this. So this isn't my axe to grind, so to speak. What I'm doing is juxtaposing some of her propositions and putting together, linking what she believes based on what she says. So premise one from her: there exists a state of development in which a fetus lacks sentience. Okay. Premise two: sentience is all that matters. If something doesn't have sentience, then then nothing else matters. How it's treated doesn't matter. She brought this to bear with you on your plants discussion. Now, so consider the following ethical, thought experiment. Suppose I take a cow, a pregnant cow who has, a litter of babies, and I have some drug. And suppose at some point in the fetal development of the cows in utero, I inject this drug in the cow that prevents it from attaining sentience in the course of normal development. Now, in your discussion with Banana Warrior Princess, she objected to the idea that, for example, you could stun a cow and remove its capacity to feel pain before you kill it. The reason she objected to it is because you disagreed about Aristotelian potentiality, and that's a whole nother discussion that I don't think we have time for really here. But what she says basically as her position is, if something has sentience now and unmolested, it will continue to have sentience in the future. Removing the sentience from that being is itself an immoral act against that being. Perfectly fine. So I can get her objection to you based on this. But juxtaposing these facts with her discussion on sentience being the only thing that matters, we can conclude that if a being never has sentience in the first place, by her own logic, which is why it doesn't apply to plants, nothing else matters. You can do whatever you want. So hypothetically, I could take a cow in utero, inject it at a point where it hasn't attained sentience, inject it with this drug so it never develops sentience, right? The cow gives birth to these cows. They're not sentient. They're basically like zombies. They have no idea of their surroundings. They have no idea what's going on. They're basically in a pseudo-comatose state. They're fed intravenously. They can produce more cows. They can get pregnant. They can, attain their functions, whatever. But they have no other sentience in any way that she would define sentience. Well, so suppose we want to kill these cows. Well, according to her, sentience is all that matters. And because they lack the ability to attain sentience, we can now kill them. Okay, well, she doesn't like the conclusion, we're going to kill cows. She's a vegan. But where along the chain of events could she object according to her model? Could she object to us taking a non-sentient being and violating its non-existent right to attain future sentience? Or would she object to killing a non-sentient being? Those are the only two crucial moments in the process by which we would have violated the cow's rights. But if sentience, the trait sentience, is necessary for the rights to attain, we've never violated the rights of the cow. Now, apply this argument in some way to human beings. Use something like Brave New World or something from Orwell. You can imagine a government that can drug and sedate and do all sorts of things to its populace to sedate them, to remove their sentience in some capacity. And by this moral framework, it now has the right to do any moral thing it wants to the non-sentient beings that it has cultivated. I think this is disgusting. I reject the moral framework out of hand. So the third thing I want to bring up is this is more of an aside so I can let people talk. This is going to be brief. When she chastised you about saying, well, you're only talking about humans, right? Your trait that you named, potential rationality. She said, well, you're basically substituting humanity in there. But this shows she doesn't understand her own argument, because going back to it, what she is saying is humans, all humans have moral value, and she agrees with this. Therefore, there is by her logic of traits, there is a trait present in all humans which contain them to have moral value. Now, she is then asking you to say what trait is absent in non-humans that makes them fail to attain this value. Well, any trait that you could present, in theory, would apply only to humans because all non-humans have it. Well, what is logically true about a fact that attains to all humans and only humans? It is a necessary component of being human, and therefore she has no right to expect that this trait you name won't be synonymous in some way. That's by the design of her own argument, and she has no one to blame but herself. So I found this thing to be very, very telling. They did this whole after-action thing after the debate where they're just mocking us. Oh, we could run circles around them, logic, blah, 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 blah. But if they can't even understand their own argument to understand the set theory and its implications about what kinds of statements can attain about the things they're asking their interlocutors, they have no room to gloat in the way they're doing. It's just awful. So I think that's about what I have to say for now, and I'll pass the floor.
Okay. You had some points you wanted to comment on, Anarcho.
Yeah. So the whole debate, the whole tactic of the vegan side of this argument seemed to rest solely on the ability to control the goalposts and to set the standards of proof as they saw fit. So what I ended up seeing is that basically Todd was asked, name the trait that separates us between humans and animals, and he would give one, such as programming or poetry, things observed in humans that are not observed in other creatures. And they would try to say, like, oh, well, other animals have been seen to do other similar things and blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And so then you would think, okay, let's go with this. Oh, these creatures have similar traits to us, down to plants who have similar traits in that they both have a similar need to consume. They move a little. They exhibit the same functions as we do. And they have the same, purpose of survival, at least. And what I liked about your argument, Todd, this goes back to an episode. This goes back to the original hangout about veganism, where you pointed out how the materialists are how when atheists try to argue against veganism and against the concept of basically leftist animal rights mysticism, it falls apart because their basic metaphysical conception of regarding determinism and the like, it just doesn't support a worldview that can allow for such hierarchical relationships. But the thing is, the vegan debaters being in that same skeptical atheist field also found themselves unable to deal with the fact that materially speaking, there's not enough of a difference between animals and plants, or even if we want to go further, even living and non-living matter. Maybe there might be even a case for just outright animism. But so that's basically I just found that the entire vegan debate had to constantly shift the premises of how fulfilling the burden of proof regarding what traits was needed, and that's all I have to say.
I think what's interesting, Anarcho, about this is that I asked them to name the trait about plants, and they couldn't do it. That's the takeaway. One of the big takeaways.
Yeah.
They said basically, she said that, well, they're not sentient, so it's irrelevant. And I said, well, animals are not rational, therefore it's irrelevant. You made a comment earlier, mediator, that when I used the sort of street evangelist tactics against them, they had a very hard time grappling with that. Would you want to elaborate on that at all?
I think the comment kind of speaks for itself. I don't know that they're used to having the argument used against them, right? And I know this with her response to you. Well, you're saying that only human is basically the trait that you're saying here, but by set composition, that's anything you're going to get is a necessary component to human being. So they lack the fundamental understanding of their argument in that way, and we know this just by how they talk about it. That when it's applied against them, they, like their interlocutors, they surprise on the street and bombard with this question. They probably didn't have a good response, right? So when you said, name the trait for plants, she said, well, sentience. And you said, well, I named rationality, and you said that was arbitrary. So why can't I call sentience arbitrary? And she says, well, because sentient things can, feel pain, and that's where the conversation kind of devolved to. But here's what I found most interesting about the whole thing, right? She was asked at one point to explain why sentience should be privileged over just the capacity for rudimentary biological, communication through chemicals, through whatever. And all she could do was say, well, it's obvious from the definition of sentience that this must be true. And that's absurd. A definition doesn't explain anything. So to be charitable, I looked at basically some of her other arguments around this. And what she said was, what's the golden rule, right? You wouldn't want this done to you, so you wouldn't do it to others. Now, she's making a very deep point there. I don't know how much she realizes how deep it is, but there's a deep point there. The reason why sentience is so important to her is because the key phrase is want to do, right? I wouldn't do to somebody else what they wouldn't want them to do to me. And so her conclusion is, well, sentient beings can't want anything, and therefore the golden rule doesn't apply to them. But I mean, that seems to be pretty superfluous in itself. So for example, if I can trick somebody into wanting something from me, right, or wanting me to do something to them, am I then justified in doing so? Right? Or if I could remove their sentience, if I could drug them or do something. Well, no. So I mean, sentience isn't sufficient. There's other things involved too. I don't think she could quite articulate the full system of what's going on there. It was just obvious from the interaction.
Well, yeah, and by conceding the potential argument, she agreed with me. So I don't see why there was a disagreement at that point at all. Now, Crow, you had some things that you wanted to add to from your observations.
Yeah, well, to build on Anarcho Rain's point about the burden of proof, right, is when they present the name the trait argument, one of the premises says that there's no trait absent in animals that, if absent in humans, would justify, eating them or whatever, right? Well, the idea is, right, if you're going to make a positive claim like that, you have to give an argument for it. And if your argument depends on asking somebody else questions, then it's not really an argument, because regardless of whether or not we or anybody else in the world can name the trait, it still doesn't mean that your argument is true. You have to provide an actual reason why there's no kind of a trait that could ever be conjured up to justify this. That was really it. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, yeah. But was there something about the after action that you wanted to bring up?
Oh well,
Bro?
I mean, Logos kind of touched on it, right? But um, you know, you know, well, ask yourself was saying a lot about how if you use terminology he can't understand, then it's not an argument. But I don't understand how if you fail to understand somebody else's terminology, that means that they're wrong. I mean, that seems like you should just try to learn more, right? But that was really it. That was more of just ask yourself. That I didn't understand when he said that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, well, there's another thing too. I think we all saw, well, heard or saw at one point that Ask Yourself said that he could defeat me in a debate. But here's the thing: the first vegan I contacted was Ask Yourself, and this is what Ask Yourself said. Can we guys see the screen cap?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, so there's this here. Scroll down a little bit more. You don't really have the level of SM presence that would make it my interest. But the Banana Warrior Princess, yada yada, they'd be happy to do it. So there's that.
right, well, and to bring something else about that, at one point in the stream, he says that he's, that he doesn't dismiss people based on their channel size or whatever. But I mean, he kind of dismissed you based on your channel size. So I don't. I
Yeah.
mean,
Wait,
I'm
he
not.
actually he said that in the stream?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
I
he
mean,
said
it
a
wasn't. I don't think it was an
threshold.
explicit thing. I don't think he was like explicitly saying that, but he was saying that somebody accused him of dodging because he only goes after people with big channels or something. And he
Yeah.
said, oh, look at my debate history. I don't, dismiss people based on channel size. But it did
This
seem
is
like,
this is
if he's going to tell you you don't have an
Yeah.
SM
Well, he
presence,
said,
that
yeah, he said there was a threshold, and that if you were under that threshold, he wouldn't debate. Or yeah, and there was something about not giving attention to really small channels.
well, yeah, again, it's but here's the other thing too. He also had a chance to respond to the video that I did 2 weeks ago. So he on Twitter. You can see here. But again, he didn't do anything with that. So clearly, I gave Ask Yourself every opportunity to throw in the ring, and the fact is, he didn't. So, really, as they say, put up or shut up, I think. So that's something that I think needs to be pointed out as
yeah,
well.
I mean, I'm sure you'd be prepared to debate, ask yourself, and take on his arguments. And look, I understand. Not everybody is a philosopher or a logician. He may not understand people's arguments, and that's no fault of his own, right? But like, to try to say that they're wrong because of it, or say that they're just trying to obfuscate. I mean, that's just being a little that's being a little overzealous, if you ask me. I mean, why would he just assume that that's what you're trying to do? I mean, maybe try to take the opportunity to understand your argument as opposed to just dismissing it like you're trying to confuse everybody. Sorry if I sound out of breath. I was outside and I was like,
No, that's fine.
sorry.
Well, yeah, because the thing that has to be drilled home again and again and again, this isn't an argument. It isn't even in a valid form. It's for all practical purposes meaningless. Now, it can be put in a valid form, and we did so in my Veganism Refuted stream. So I don't need to go in there again. We already covered that base. But I think you wanted to mention something about naturalism, media mediated.
Yeah, and that's actually a good thing. I forgot his quip on the tweet about they assumed I was a moral objectivist. Let's tie all this together here for a second. We didn't assume, Ask Yourself, that you're a moral objectivist. We said you must be a moral objectivist for the statement, human beings have moral value to attain logical truth value, because by definition, that's what moral objectivism means. So if your argument is to hold, you must be this thing. I'm not assuming you are that thing. I mean, you can have all the cognitive dissonance that you'd like to have. Your initial premise can be as meaningless to you, despite what you think as you'd like it to be. But the fact of the matter is, your premise, human beings have moral value, being a moral statement, can't attain truth value unless you have a moral framework which assumes moral statements can attain truth value. End of discussion. Now, as far as how we get into naturalism and the rest of that they talked about on Twitter, this is the point. I think maybe you and Mathoma might have gone too far in painting too many vegans as atheists and naturalists with a broad brush. That could be.
Well, he was. I heard
Yeah, he could be. I don't know much about him. So to the extent that some people who aren't atheists and naturalists, they might not like our arguments. So I think proper phrasing is important, right? We're not saying that all vegans are naturalists or anything of the sort. I think the precise argument we're trying to make here, and what you tried to make in the stream here, is if natural determinism is true, then it makes no sense to bring up the name the trait argument, because the entire idea is that we can choose to give moral value to things based on their traits. But if everything is naturally determined, we can't choose anything, and the entire argument is bunk. Now, Banana Warrior Princess tried to talk about the whole lion thing, right? Well, the lion can't choose, but we can choose. Well, if we're naturally determined, we can't choose. The entire lion example was silly, and it showed she didn't really understand what you're getting at, right? What you're getting at with rationality, naturalism, determinism, and all these points, the real core issue, to break it down to quote layman's terms, is do we have the metaphysical capacity to choose otherwise in our engagements? Why do we have that capacity? If naturalism is true, we don't. If naturalism is false, we do. It comes from somewhere. At the very, very minimum, you don't have to bring the soul and Christianity and religion into it. I'm not a Christian, for example. But let's talk about a property of humanity. We choose, while lions and other animals and stuff can't morally choose or morally reflect on their statements or say, it would be more moral if I did X. We have that ability to choose because there is some inherent trait of rationality to human beings that isn't true of the animals that are unable to make these moral choices. And therefore, I mean, that's the trait if we're going to go down the argument. But I've already said about how I feel about the argument in general and how traits reflect morality. I don't like that anyway. But even if that were true, I mean, you addressed it. So this entire way that the naturalism discussion happened, how it continues to happen, shows that they're fundamentally missing the point on the issue.
Right, and just to build more on the naturalism thing, I mean, then you also run into the problem, like David Hume's ought is distinction, even if it is the case that there are no traits absent in animals, right? Like, that doesn't tell you what you should do or what you ought to do, because it's just a descriptive statement of nature. It's not a prescriptive ethic. If you want a prescriptive ethic to hold truth value, you have to establish truth claims to moral facts, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I would agree. I think really the most telling point of this entire debate that really just sums everything up is at 342 to 345, BWP says, I don't understand philosophy and my audience doesn't either. And then she says 2 minutes later at 545, the fact that humans have value, it logically follows that animals do too. But she just admitted she doesn't understand logic. So how does she know that it logically follows? It just, that I think just sort of highlights the whole thing. Do you have anything you want to say about that, guys?
I like Mediator's comments. But she wrote an ethics books once, a whole 7 pages.
Oh my. Well, I would recommend for anybody that's interested in studying ethics and meta-ethics to watch the wonderful videos by Inspiring Philosophy on these issues of ethics and meta-ethics. But is there anything else that you guys would like to comment about the actual debate before we wrap this up?
I'm good. I've commented on everything I've given sufficient thought to, and I don't want to risk putting foot in mouth. So I think I'll leave it here.
Okay, well, thank you guys for showing up. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.